Welcome back to Code Corner with Dan Decker. Before the break, Dan was telling us a unique story about a residential fire alarm system. Now let's move on to the commercial side. Dan, how does understanding the code play out in those scenarios?
We're actually perceived by the customer as the code expert. We're supposed to know what they need. And we recently had a project where a client, it was a college, contacted us and said, we're redoing the fire alarm in this building. We need a new fire alarm that complies with current codes. Can you give us a quote? And we said, sure. And we went and quoted the system. And they called back a few weeks later and they said, we've got some questions about your quote. Like, okay. And what are the questions? And they said, well, we were required to obtain multiple quotes. And your system, I think we included a dozen smoke detectors in our system, in our quote. And they said, we asked one of your competitors for a quote and they had over 100 smoke detectors on the system. It's like, which is right? It's like, well, what is your interest? You know, we could do additional smoke detectors, but what we quoted was in line with what the code required for your occupancy. And they said, that's exactly what we want. We don't have the funding to do a lot of work that we hadn't planned on. And not only would the extra 100 smoke detectors cost more money for material, it would cost quite a bit more money for labor. So the cost is really a multiplier. When you add equipment, the installation cost is usually 2 or 3 times the cost of the equipment. So it was a big deal. And so we went back and showed the customer that we were a listed firm, that the state had approved us as a qualified firm, is the term that they use in Michigan, and that our system quotation met the requirements of the code. And so they went ahead and gave us the order. We submitted it to the state fire marshal for review, and they have just approved it. So we were right.
So, moral of the story is that knowing and understanding the code can really save our customers money while still ensuring safety. Obviously, there's a lot of different standards and codes in the fire alarm world. Can you give us a quick overview of how they generally relate to each other?
Yes. This is probably the most important thing for somebody that's in the fire alarm business, is to understand how the codes interact with each other. There's probably a half a dozen codes that we normally utilize in our everyday work. And there's a hierarchy to the codes. And it's really important. In fact, I meet people that have been in the industry for 15, 20 years and they don't understand this. But the building code is at the top of the hierarchy. The building code is put together by building code officials, and they essentially perform a cost benefit analysis. And they say, okay, for this size building with this many people in it, what do we want to do? Do we need fire alarms? Do we need sprinklers? Do we need a fire resistant construction? Because there's costs for everything. It's if you build a building with a fire alarm and if you build a building without a fire alarm, the one with the fire alarm costs more money, but it has more value. So that's essentially what they're doing, is assessing that. So the building code takes all of the different occupancies and determines if you need a fire alarm system and how much of a fire alarm system you need. In some cases, you need something that's very basic, just a manual activation and an occupant notification, and that's it. In other occupancies, they want to see smoke detection, and rather than just occupant notification, where you've got a large number of occupants, the code typically requires a voice alarm evacuation. Why that's important is because that allows a fire code or a fire official that's responding to the scene of a fire to give directions to the occupants. If you respond to a high rise that is 20 stories high and there's a fire on the 15th floor, you may want the people that are above the 15th floor to actually go upwards, and they'll rescue them from the roof, as opposed to having them try and go down through maybe a compromised floor. So that's an example of some of the things that we can do with the fire alarm. Is we can actually use a voice instructions, not only canned instructions that are programmed into the system, but we allow the firefighters to actually give directions through a microphone and tell people what to do. So the building code tells us when it's required to have a fire alarm system, and it tells us, if you've got to have a fire alarm system, how much you need to have. There are related codes that are kind of subservient to the building code. The next code that is in line is basically the fire code, and that's generally administered by the fire department. And what the fire code does is takes over after the building is built. So from the time that a building, you apply for a permit up until you get what's called the certificate of occupancy, which means the building process is completed and the building complies and is certified to comply with all the requirements of the building code. That whole time span is under the jurisdiction of the building code. Once you've been issued a certificate of occupancy, you've now got an existing building, and that falls under the fire code. And what the fire code officials are focused on is that you maintain the level of protection that was required by the building code. So one of the requirements of the fire code is you cannot take out any fire alarm device without the permission of the fire code official. So if the building code required you to have smoke detectors in your building, and after a couple of years decide, boy, those are expensive to maintain, I'm going to take them out, the fire code official would prevent that from happening because they are focused on maintaining the minimum requirements that the building code required to get the building built. Other code codes that we use are more specific. For example, when you put together a building, in addition to the building code, there's the plumbing code, the mechanical code, the electrical code. And the mechanical code is something that we utilize because it requires smoke detectors. Anytime there's a penetration of a smoke barrier in the building, there has to be fire dampers or smoke dampers, and smoke detectors have to control those so that we don't move smoke from one part of the building to the other. We also, as I mentioned earlier, we'll shut down an air handler if we detect that it's spreading smoke. We'll shut the air handler down so that it stops spreading smoke. So those requirements are found in the mechanical code. And then the electrical code doesn't tell us when to install a fire alarm system, but it says, here's how you do it in terms of the electrical wiring, the methods and materials. It tells you what type of wire you can use, deals with voltages that are involved and how you have to separate them for safety. There's a number of requirements that we deal with in the electrical code. And then we've got a fun little book called the National Fire Alarm Code. And that is referenced by both the mechanical code, the building code, and the fire code. They all tell you that you have to put in a fire alarm system, do it per the requirements of NFPA 72, which is the National Fire Alarm Code. And NFPA 72 is probably something we'll be doing additional meetings on, but that covers how to install a fire alarm system. And it covers everything from documentation to power supplies to initiating devices, notification appliances, and then it even has a chapter specifically for household fire alarms. So it's a very detailed book on how to put in a fire alarm system, but it doesn't tell you when to put it in. That's the building code thing. And that's what a lot of people get mixed up on. I was at an NFPA conference a few years ago, and there was an electrical engineer. He had been working on a daycare, and he said, yes, he says, they really need to do something because NFPA 72 doesn't say a thing about daycare centers. No, it's not supposed to. That's not the role in the process. That's a building code issue.
So Dan, in simple terms, the building code says what and when, and NFPA 72 is the how.
Exactly. And the electrical code, the National Electrical Code, is also published by NFPA, and that is kind of a companion document. I've been on the technical committee for NFPA 72 for 35 years now. And so I've learned a lot of the inside rules. And one of the inside rules is that the NFPA 72, the National Electric Code Committee, they have their own turf. And that includes boxes and wiring. And so we can't touch their turf in the fire alarm code. We cannot, for example, we tried this one year, tried to specify that a pull station had to be attached to an electrical back box. And we were out of scope at that point. That was somebody else's turf. So that the NEC and the National Fire Alarm Code are both administered by the same organization, and it's actually a lot of the same people in terms of staffing from NFPA. But there's definite roles, and we cannot do too much with regulating wiring and conduit in the National Fire Alarm Code. And in the National Electrical Code, they pretty much restrict themselves to the installation methods and materials.
Dan, this has been incredibly helpful in understanding the basics of fire alarm and the role of these very important codes. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
You're welcome.
That's all the time we have for today's episode of Code Corner with Dan Decker. Thanks for your time, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll catch you next time.